Police, get on the ground!
What is this? I have rights!
Hands where I can see them, now!
Where's your warrant?
The absolute silence of NASA's hypermodern Johnson Space Center laboratories during the night shift was shattered by the piercing sound of containment alarms. Bathed in a cold, blue fluorescent light, the sterile environment, filled with multi-million-dollar equipment and futuristic ambition, contrasted violently with the dirty water now flooding the linoleum floor. The brilliant astrophysicist and commander, 42-year-old Dr. Maya Vance, stopped abruptly at the reinforced glass door. Her life's entire work, the critical life support experiment for the Artemis Ares Mars mission, was completely destroyed, with chemical smoke rising from the shattered remains of the biodome. It was a paralyzing visual shock that preceded the absolute worst night of her illustrious career. If this breathtaking premise has already captured your attention, subscribe to the channel and comment from which city you are watching this incredible story unfold. In the center of that incalculable disaster, huddled on the wet floor, was Marcus, a 17-year-old boy wearing a faded blue janitorial jumpsuit that was visibly too large for his thin frame. He trembled uncontrollably, his tears mixing with the dirty water on the floor as he vainly tried to gather soaked pieces of paper. Beside him stood the imposing and bitter figure of Miller, the head janitor. The older man maintained an aggressive posture, his face red with false indignation as he shouted unforgivable insults, pointing a thick finger at the terrified teenager's face. Marcus, a brilliant young man from a marginalized neighborhood who worked late nights to pay for his sick mother's medical expenses, saw his engineering dreams crumble. He would be fired, arrested for federal property damage, and have his life completely ruined for a crime he didn't commit. Dr. Vance walked slowly into the ruined laboratory, her pristine white lab coat brushing against the destroyed equipment. Accustomed to masking any emotion beneath an intensely focused and unreadable expression, Maya represented the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. She had fought against a lifetime of systemic prejudice to reach the leadership of the Martian mission. However, the continuous trauma of constantly having to prove her worth had transformed her into an emotionally distant and hyper-rational woman. She was obsessed with going to Mars precisely because, in secret, she had given up on Earth and its deeply flawed people. As she walked through the wreckage of her most ambitious project, Maya's usual coldness seemed unshakable, observing the destruction of millions of dollars without shedding a single tear, isolated in her own intellectual orbit and shielded against human pain. Taking advantage of the commander's heavy silence, Miller raised his voice, distilling a racist venom loaded with deep resentment against Maya's authority in that laboratory. He reported, with a repugnant false conviction, that the clumsy ghetto kid had messed with the complex machines, disconnecting the thermal regulator out of pure ignorance and absolute stupidity. To crown his malicious lie and cover up his own act of deliberate sabotage, the janitor kicked an old, worn-out notebook across the flooded floor. The object stopped exactly at Dr. Vance's feet, splashing dirty water onto her perfectly clean boots. Miller smiled deceitfully, claiming that the diary was the definitive proof that the teenager spent his late nights snooping where he shouldn't, instead of scrubbing the floors that the true geniuses of the American Space Agency used to walk on every single day. Maya slowly bent down and picked up the soaked notebook, the cold water dripping through her precise fingers. The expectation in the room was of an imminent explosion of fury and an immediate call for armed security. However, as she opened the stuck and blurred pages, the commander's breath hitched, her dark, calculating eyes widened in absolute shock. Those were not childish doodles or the drawings of an inattentive teenager. They were flawless trajectory calculations, extremely complex orbital mechanics equations, and theoretical notes that only the rarest minds in the institution could possibly comprehend. The realization hit her with the undeniable force of a meteor. On those dirty, torn pages, Maya did not just see brilliant numbers. She saw her own image in the past. She saw her younger, vulnerable self fighting desperately to be noticed. That millisecond of recognition instantly shattered the thick emotional armor that Dr. Vance had painstakingly built over decades. Completely ignoring the incalculable loss of the destroyed experiment and the strict protocol that governed her entire life, Maya took an unthinkable action. She bent her knees and knelt on the filthy, soaked floor, staining her perfectly white lab coat without a second thought. The scientist did not look at the ruined machines, but rather directly into Marcus's tearful, terrified eyes. In that fleeting moment of pure connection and human vulnerability, The vast abyss between the hyper-rational commander and the frightened janitor disappeared entirely. With a firm, protective gesture, she helped the boy gather the rest of his destroyed papers. A silent, irreversible decision formed in her mind. She would never allow another brilliant mind to be crushed by prejudice. Dr. Maya Vance had spent her entire life fighting a silent, exhausting war against systemic prejudice and invisible barriers. Growing up in a fractured home, she learned early that brilliance was never enough if you didn't look like the established architects of the future. Every academic milestone, every doctorate, and every promotion at NASA was brutally contested by peers who viewed her presence as an anomaly rather than a hard-earned right. This relentless battle for validation had fundamentally forged her into a formidable, untouchable commander. But it had also hollowed out her heart. She became hyper-rational, burying her vulnerabilities beneath layers of flawless calculations and an imposing, pristine white lab coat. The trauma of constantly proving her undeniable worth had slowly alienated her from humanity, leaving her emotionally isolated and secretly longing to abandon Earth altogether for the sterile, predictable silence of deep space. Marcus, on the other hand, was intimately familiar with the crushing weight of terrestrial struggles, carrying burdens far too heavy for a 17-year-old boy. He lived in a marginalized, crumbling neighborhood where hope was a luxury few could afford, spending his nights sweeping the gleaming floors of the Space Center to pay for his mother's escalating medical bills. His baggy, faded blue janitorial jumpsuit swallowed his thin frame, a visual reminder of his perceived insignificance in a building filled with the world's most celebrated minds. Despite the exhaustion painting dark circles under his eyes, his spirit remained stubbornly unbroken. His worn-out notebook, hidden carefully in his cleaning cart, was a sanctuary of complex orbital mechanics and pure dreams. He swept the sterile corridors with absolute reverence, gazing at the rockets and idolizing Dr. Vance, hoping that one day he could also touch the stars. The cruelty of reality, however, constantly threatened to extinguish the boy's fragile optimism. The head janitor, an openly racist and deeply bitter man named Miller, made it his personal mission to systematically crush Marcus's aspirations. Miller resented the changing world around him, harboring a toxic hatred for Dr. Vance's authority and projecting that venom onto the vulnerable teenager. He would assign Marcus the most grueling, degrading tasks, mocking his worn-out notebook and laughing at the absurdity of a marginalized kid dreaming of aerospace engineering. Every cruel joke and deliberate humiliation was a calculated attempt to remind Marcus of his assigned place at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. Yet, despite the psychological torment and physical exhaustion, Marcus endured the abuse in silence, desperately holding on to his grueling job because his mother's survival depended entirely on his meager weekly paycheck. Following the devastating sabotage of her life support experiment, Maya's predictable, sterile world was irrevocably shattered. Instead of summoning federal security to arrest the terrified teenager, she defied every institutional protocol and her own fiercely guarded isolation. She quietly transferred Marcus from the custodial night crew, pulling strings in the shadows to appoint him as her personal, albeit unofficial, laboratory assistant. This unprecedented decision was an immense professional risk, a direct violation of the strict security clearances required in the multi-million-dollar facility. But looking at the brilliant, perfectly executed orbital equations in his soaked notebook, Maya realized she could not let another gifted mind be suffocated by the exact same prejudice she had barely survived. For the first time in her illustrious career, the hyper-rational commander made a choice driven entirely by raw human empathy, rather than cold, calculated scientific logic. The initial days of their secret collaboration were fraught with an intense, unspoken tension. Marcus arrived at the gleaming laboratory without his faded blue janitorial jumpsuit, wearing a slightly oversized, donated white button-down shirt that only emphasized his youth and vulnerability. He moved with extreme caution, terrified of breaking the expensive equipment or angering the imposing commander who had miraculously saved him from federal prison. Maya, unaccustomed to sharing her sanctuary or dealing with another person's deep-seated insecurities, remained emotionally distant, communicating exclusively through complex mathematical directives. The stark contrast between the facility's unimaginable material wealth and the boy's obvious emotional and financial poverty was painfully evident. Yet, As they stood side by side analyzing the complex telemetry data of the upcoming Mars mission, an undeniable intellectual synergy began to bridge the vast gap between the brilliant veteran and the traumatized prodigy. The sterile silence of the laboratory was finally broken late one evening when Maya noticed Marcus quietly staring at a microscopic imperfection on a titanium valve. "You see a structural anomaly, don't you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the ground before he softly replied, "The thermal stress vectors don't align with the manufacturer's promises, Commander. It will fracture under atmospheric re-entry." Maya paused, staring intensely at the young boy who had just casually identified a catastrophic flaw that her entire engineering team had completely missed. She stepped closer, her pristine white lab coat brushing against the cold metal tables. "Why didn't you speak up earlier, Marcus?" she asked, her tone shifting from a commanding officer to a genuinely curious mentor. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of repressed suffering. Marcus looked down at his scuffed sneakers, his voice trembling slightly as he articulated the harsh reality of his existence. "Because people like me aren't supposed to find mistakes made by people like them," he whispered, a tear escaping his eye. "Whenever I tried to show Mr. Miller a better way to mix the chemical cleaners, he would kick my bucket over and tell me to stop pretending I was smart." Maya felt a sharp, physical ache in her chest, a phantom pain from her own traumatic past echoing in the boy's heartbreaking confession. She saw the heavy burden of systemic poverty and relentless bullying weighing down his narrow shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she placed a firm, reassuring hand on his trembling shoulder. "You are not sweeping floors anymore, Marcus," she stated with unwavering conviction. "You are building the future." That profound interaction marked a definitive shift in their dynamic, transforming the sterile laboratory into a sanctuary of mutual healing. Maya slowly began to dismantle the thick emotional walls she had spent decades constructing, finding unexpected comfort in the boy's pure, uncorrupted passion for the cosmos. Marcus, in turn, blossomed under her demanding but fiercely protective mentorship, his natural genius expanding rapidly as he gained access to the agency's classified mainframes. They would spend hours debating complex orbital trajectories and biodome sustainability, their voices echoing through the empty halls of the night shift. For Maya, the overwhelming isolation that had characterized her brilliant career began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of purpose that had nothing to do with her impending Mars mission. She was no longer just preparing to leave humanity behind. She was actively nurturing its brightest hidden spark. However, the harsh realities of Marcus's life outside the Space Center refused to be ignored. One rainy Tuesday, he arrived at the laboratory looking completely devastated, dark circles deeply etched beneath his eyes and his hands shaking uncontrollably. Maya immediately noticed the shift, halting her presentation on Martian atmospheric entry to ask what was wrong. Breaking down in tears, Marcus confessed that his mother's illness had suddenly worsened, and the hospital was threatening to suspend her treatments due to overwhelming unpaid bills. The raw, unfiltered desperation in the young boy's voice shattered Maya's remaining emotional barriers. She saw a brilliant mind on the verge of being destroyed by circumstances completely outside of his control. Without a second thought, she silently transferred a significant portion of her substantial personal savings to the hospital, anonymously clearing the crushing debt that threatened his family. As the emotional bond between the hyper-rational commander and the vulnerable prodigy deepened, a profound internal conflict began to tear Maya apart. She was scheduled to leave Earth for a grueling 3-year mission to Mars in just a matter of weeks, a lifelong dream that was now suddenly tinged with an unexpected heavy sorrow. Attaching herself so deeply to Marcus meant inevitably leaving a piece of her newly awakened heart behind on the very planet she had desperately wanted to escape. She found herself staring out of the massive glass windows of the Space Center, looking at the distant city lights, and questioning her ultimate purpose. Was it truly a victory to conquer the unforgiving vacuum of deep space if she abandoned the fragile, brilliant soul she had just rescued? The sterile ambition of the Mars mission suddenly felt cold compared to pure human connection. While Maya wrestled with her complex emotional awakening, a sinister external threat was actively plotting their downfall in the shadows. Miller, the bitter head janitor, had noticed Marcus's sudden disappearance from the night custodial crew and his inexplicable presence in the highly restricted engineering sectors. Driven by a toxic blend of deep-seated racism and injured pride, Miller began secretly monitoring their activities, lurking in the dimly lit service corridors to gather malicious evidence. He watched with seething resentment as the commander treated the marginalized kid with a level of intellectual respect she rarely showed to her decorated peers. Determined to destroy them both and cover up his own previous sabotage of the life support experiment, Miller began rallying his influential union contacts, spreading vicious rumors that Dr. Vance was wildly violating federal protocol and compromising the security of the multi-billion-dollar Mars mission for a common cleaner. The malicious gossip swiftly escalated into a formal bureaucratic nightmare that threatened to derail everything Maya had fought for. Miller officially filed multiple formal complaints to NASA's Human Resources and the Internal Security Division, aggressively claiming that the commander was playing dangerous favorites and illegally granting classified data access to an unvetted civilian. The allegations were heavily laced with discriminatory undertones, suggesting that Marcus's socioeconomic background made him an inherent security risk to the nation's aerospace ambitions. The bureaucratic directors, terrified of a massive public relations scandal erupting right before the historic Artemis Ares launch, immediately descended upon Maya's pristine laboratory. Men in expensive suits and rigid expressions demanded immediate answers, waving thick folders of federal regulations and threatening to suspend her command if she did not terminate her unofficial mentorship. The sterile environment suddenly became a hostile battleground of politics and deeply entrenched institutional prejudice. Maya stood firmly against the intimidating board of directors, her expression reverting to the unreadable, icy facade she had perfected over decades of survival. She argued passionately that Marcus's contributions to the telemetry data were invaluable, mathematically proving that his presence enhanced the mission's safety protocols rather than jeopardizing them. However, the rigid bureaucracy was completely blind to the boy's genius, seeing only a massive liability dressed in second-hand clothes. They gave her a harsh, non-negotiable ultimatum. Either she permanently dismisses Marcus from the facility and banishes him back to the custodial staff, or she would be immediately stripped of her command and removed from the Mars mission entirely. The weight of the impossible choice crushed her spirit. The life she had envisioned among the stars was now in direct conflict with the fragile human life she had fiercely sworn to protect on Earth. Unbeknownst to the directors, Marcus had silently overheard the entire devastating confrontation from the adjacent observation room. The crushing realization that his mere presence was actively destroying the career of the only person who had ever truly believed in him sent him into a spiral of overwhelming guilt. He looked at his worn-out notebook, suddenly feeling like the worthless fraud that Miller had always claimed him to be. The trauma of his lifelong marginalization convinced him that he was nothing more than a dangerous burden to the brilliant commander. That night, after the directors left, Marcus quietly packed his few belongings into a faded backpack, leaving his precious notebook on Maya's spotless desk. He decided to sacrifice his own dreams, preparing to walk away from the Space Center forever to ensure that Dr. Vance could rightfully claim her hard-earned place among the distant stars. Maya found him walking heavily toward the main exit, his shoulders slumped in total defeat under the cold glow of the security lights. She sprinted across the polished linoleum floor, completely abandoning her usual composed demeanor, and grabbed his arm firmly. "Where do you think you are going?" she demanded, her voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. Marcus refused to look her in the eyes, his voice breaking as he explained that he could not let her lose the Mars mission because of a marginalized kid who didn't belong. Maya felt tears stinging her eyes, a visceral reaction she hadn't experienced in years. She turned him around gently, forcing him to look at her. "You belong exactly where your brilliant mind takes you," she whispered fiercely. "And I am not letting them win. We are going to fight this together, Marcus. Do you understand me?" The decision to fight the institutional bureaucracy head-on required a level of strategic brilliance that rivaled their complex orbital calculations. Maya and Marcus retreated to the secure laboratory, locking the heavy doors and diving deep into the massive servers containing the facility's raw operational data. They weren't just looking for a defense. They were hunting for the undeniable truth. For 3 agonizing, sleepless days, they sifted through millions of lines of encrypted code, cross-referencing thermal logs, security badge accesses, and equipment maintenance schedules. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the emotional connection between them solidified into an unbreakable bond. Marcus's unparalleled ability to recognize microscopic patterns in chaotic data proved to be the ultimate key to their salvation. Together, surrounded by empty coffee cups and glowing monitors, they meticulously built an impenetrable mathematical fortress that would expose the dark, prejudiced rot festering within the renowned agency. In the final hours before the scheduled disciplinary hearing, a breakthrough of monumental proportions occurred. Marcus's exhausted eyes widened as he correlated the precise thermal fluctuation of the sabotaged biodome with a specific digital footprint in the facility's grid. "Commander," he whispered, his voice trembling. The thermal regulator wasn't just unplugged. The localized power grid was deliberately rerouted 2 minutes before the failure. Maya rushed to his side, her mind instantly processing the undeniable implications of his discovery. The data flawlessly proved that the catastrophic failure was an intentional, premeditated act of sabotage, and the digital logs pointed directly to the maintenance overrides controlled exclusively by the head janitor. Miller hadn't just framed Marcus. He had arrogantly left a digital trail of his own malicious crime. Maya's expression hardened into a terrifying mask of absolute, calculated resolve. The prey was about to become the predator. The morning of the formal NASA disciplinary hearing arrived with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that permeated the entire Space Center. The sterile boardroom was filled with high-ranking directors, union representatives, and federal security officers, all expecting the swift and humiliating termination of a brilliant commander's career over an unauthorized street kid. Marcus sat quietly in the sterile waiting area, his hands gripping his worn notebook so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He was terrified, surrounded by the overwhelming power of an institution that had always viewed him as invisible or dangerous. Inside the room, Miller sat comfortably in his chair, a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his face as he prepared to deliver his rehearsed lies. He believed he had successfully destroyed the woman who threatened his fragile ego and the marginalized boy who dared to look up at the stars. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom remained closed, the silence inside broken only by the arrogant whispers of the men who thought they held the universe in their hands. They eagerly awaited the arrival of the broken, humiliated scientist they intended to discard. However, they were not prepared for the storm that was about to unleash itself within those sterile walls. Maya Vance was no longer the emotionally detached, hyper-rational woman who wanted to flee the Earth. The deep emotional connection she had forged with Marcus had resurrected her humanity, transforming her lingering trauma into an unstoppable force of nature. She was not walking into that room to defend herself. She was walking in to dismantle a corrupt system and fight for the future of a boy who deserved the universe. The handle of the boardroom door finally began to turn, signaling the imminent climax. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud, instantly silencing the arrogant whispers of the assembled directors. A formal NASA disciplinary hearing was convened to officially fire Marcus and reprimand the brilliant scientist. But the woman who entered was not there to surrender. Maya, who usually attended these bureaucratic meetings in unassuming civilian clothes, walked through the doors wearing her full, heavily patched blue commander's flight suit. It was the ultimate, undeniable symbol of absolute authority and her unparalleled achievements within the agency. The entire room fell dead silent, the oppressive atmosphere instantly shattered by her commanding presence. Miller, the head janitor, sat there smugly just moments before, but now his face drained of color as he finally realized the immense power of the woman he had foolishly attempted to sabotage and destroy. Without waiting for the committee chairman to speak, Maya strode confidently to the head of the long mahogany table, her boots echoing sharply against the polished floor. She did not come alone. She gently but firmly pulled Marcus into the room, positioning the terrified teenager right beside her. The directors shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, outraged by the unauthorized presence of the marginalized kid in a highly classified disciplinary hearing. The chairman opened his mouth to object, waving a thick folder of federal regulations, but Maya silenced him with a single, devastatingly sharp look. She was no longer a traumatized woman begging for validation from an elite institution. She was a fierce protector standing between a brilliant, vulnerable prodigy and the systemic prejudice that sought to crush his undeniable potential and ruin his fragile future. With devastating calm, Maya bypassed the standard procedural protocols and directly accessed the boardroom's main projector console. The massive screen behind her illuminated the dark room, displaying the incredibly complex, raw telemetry data of the ruined Mars life support experiment. "You convened this hearing to discuss a security breach and the destruction of multi-million-dollar federal property," she stated, her voice echoing with cold, mathematical precision. "I am here to present the undeniable truth." She highlighted a specific sequence of encrypted code, expertly breaking down the localized power grid fluctuations that occurred exactly 2 minutes before the catastrophic failure. The high-ranking directors leaned forward, their initial outrage slowly transforming into profound shock as they read the flawless equations. The undeniable data proved mathematically exactly when and how the vital thermal regulator was deliberately tampered with, completely ruling out accidental interference. Maya slowly turned her piercing gaze toward the corner of the room where Miller was physically shrinking in his chair. "The digital logs point directly to the maintenance overrides controlled exclusively by the head janitor," she declared, the weight of her words crushing the bitter man's malicious lies. She methodically dismantled his fabricated narrative, exposing the digital trail of his premeditated crime to the federal security officers present in the room. The smug, racist janitor who had tormented Marcus for months was now trembling uncontrollably, realizing he was facing severe federal prison time for intentionally sabotaging critical aerospace equipment. Maya completely destroyed his career without raising her voice, using the absolute power of undeniable facts to obliterate the prejudiced rot that had festered in the shadows of the agency. Miller's malicious reign of terror was finally over. However, the commander's true objective was not merely vengeance against a bitter old man. It was the absolute vindication of the brilliant boy standing beside her. Maya shifted the focus of the stunned boardroom away from the ruined equipment and directly onto Marcus's worn-out notebook, which she placed respectfully on the mahogany table. "I did not decode this encrypted digital footprint alone," she confessed, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its commanding authority. "The person who identified the microscopic thermal anomalies and proved this deliberate sabotage is the same marginalized teenager you are desperately trying to banish." She forced the elite directors to look at the impoverished kid from a broken neighborhood, explicitly detailing how his unparalleled genius had just saved the agency from a catastrophic failure that their own decorated engineers had completely missed. A profound, transformative silence enveloped the sterile boardroom as Maya turned to face Marcus, her icy exterior permanently shattered by genuine raw emotion. "For my entire life, I believed that my ultimate purpose was to escape this planet, to leave behind the cruelty and prejudice that constantly tried to hold me down," she admitted, tears glistening in her dark eyes. "I thought the greatest achievement a human could accomplish was reaching the distant, silent vacuum of Mars." She placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the heavy burden he had carried for so long. "But this young man taught me something far more important," she continued, her voice breaking the silent tension. "He showed me that a true commander's job isn't just to lead a privileged crew into the stars, but to elevate those left in the dark." The emotional impact of her heartfelt declaration resonated deeply within the cold, bureaucratic walls of the renowned Space Center. Maya turned back to the speechless committee, her posture radiating an unbreakable resolve. "I am not just asking you to clear his name and drop these ridiculous charges," she demanded, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am formally requesting that Marcus be immediately granted a full, unrestricted NASA scholarship to the university of his choice, fully funded by this agency." The directors stared in disbelief at the unprecedented demand, but Maya did not flinch. She laid her heavily patched flight helmet on the table, a silent ultimatum. "If you refuse to invest in a mind this brilliant because of where he comes from, then you do not deserve to have me command your historic mission to Mars." The devastating ultimatum hung in the air, a testament to a magnificent transformation born from pure human connection. Overwhelmed by the undeniable proof of sabotage and the sheer moral force of the commander's conviction, the chairman slowly nodded in agreement, officially granting the life-changing scholarship. Marcus broke down into uncontrollable sobs, burying his face in his hands as the crushing weight of a lifetime of poverty and systemic humiliation was instantly lifted from his young shoulders. Maya embraced him tightly, tears freely streaming down her own cheeks, completely indifferent to the bewildered gazes of the high-ranking officials. In that beautiful, chaotic moment, the brilliant astrophysicist finally found her true home, not in the distant orbit of a red planet, but in the profoundly fragile, deeply emotional heart of humanity. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The immediate aftermath of the hearing saw justice swiftly served as federal security officers escorted Miller off the premises in handcuffs, his smug demeanor entirely erased. The bitter former janitor now faced significant federal prison time for maliciously sabotaging critical aerospace equipment, permanently removing his toxic presence from the prestigious facility. Weeks later, the highly anticipated launch day of the historic Artemis Ares mission finally arrived, painting the Texas sky with brilliant hues of dawn. Commander Maya Vance stood proudly at the base of the massive rocket, taking a deep breath of the warm morning air. She was no longer a traumatized woman desperately running away from a broken Earth. Thanks to a brilliant boy, she was flying into the unknown cosmos with a completely renewed, profound love for humanity, deeply connected to the world she was leaving behind. Deep within the heavily secured walls of Houston's mission control, the atmosphere buzzed with intense, focused energy as the final countdown commenced. Standing proudly among the world's elite engineers, Marcus watched the giant digital screens with wide, tear-filled eyes. He was no longer wearing the baggy, faded blue custodial jumpsuit that had once marked his invisible, marginalized existence. Instead, he wore a crisp, perfectly fitted white NASA intern polo shirt, the official emblem resting directly over his beating heart. His mother's medical treatments were fully secured, and his prestigious university scholarship was officially finalized. As the thunderous roar of the rocket engines violently shook the facility, Marcus placed his hand against the glass observation window, whispering a silent, heartfelt thank you to the brilliant commander who had bravely sacrificed her own impenetrable armor to completely rewrite his tragic destiny. 5 incredible years later, the desolate, rust-colored landscape of the Martian surface stretched endlessly beneath a dark, star-studded alien sky. Commander Maya Vance, wearing her bulky, dust-covered extravehicular mobility unit, stood triumphantly outside the fully operational, heavily reinforced Artemis base camp. The harsh, unforgiving environment of the Red Planet was exactly the silent, isolated vacuum she had once desperately craved during her darkest years of systemic trauma. Yet, as she gazed across the magnificent craters, she no longer felt the crushing weight of emotional emptiness that used to define her brilliant existence. Holding a sleek, highly advanced communication tablet in her thickly gloved hands, she eagerly awaited the scheduled daily transmission from her home planet. The incredible scientific milestones she achieved meant nothing compared to the beautiful human connection she had fought so fiercely to preserve and protect. The tablet screen flickered brightly before stabilizing, revealing the familiar, bustling environment of Earth's primary mission control center millions of miles away. Sitting confidently at the prestigious flight director's console, surrounded by complex orbital charts and crucial telemetry data, was a sharp, 22-year-old Marcus. The frightened, impoverished teenager who used to hide his brilliant equations in a dirty cleaning cart had vanished entirely, replaced by a formidable, highly respected aerospace engineer. He adjusted his communication headset with practiced ease, his dark eyes radiating an undeniable intelligence and profound gratitude that transcended the vast emptiness of deep space. Looking directly into the camera lens, bridging the unimaginable cosmic distance between them, Marcus smiled warmly at the woman who had single-handedly saved his life. He took a deep breath, perfectly embodying the magnificent future she had bravely fought to build. "Houston to Mars base," Marcus stated, his voice resonating with absolute, unwavering confidence across the interplanetary transmission delay. "We read you loud and clear, Commander. Your atmospheric stabilization data is flawless, and we are ready for the next phase." Maya smiled brightly behind her reflective golden visor, a genuine expression of pure joy that she once thought completely impossible. As she listened to the brilliant young man guiding her safely through the stars, The profound truth of their incredible journey finally settled deep within her soul. The absolute greatest leaps for mankind are never actually made by simply building faster rockets and permanently leaving our fractured world behind. True, everlasting progress is only achieved by bravely reaching down into the shadows and relentlessly lifting up those brilliant minds who are cruelly kept grounded by ignorance and systemic prejudice. This incredible story of resilience, unexpected mentorship, and the total destruction of institutional barriers proves that our shared humanity is our ultimate strength. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life, just like Commander Vance did when she risked her historic mission for a marginalized boy? Leave a little heart in the comments below if you truly believe that pure love and empathy are infinitely more powerful than any material wealth or bureaucratic power. Subscribe to the channel right now for more deeply emotional, inspiring second-chance stories that celebrate the undeniable triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Don't forget to interact with our community and comment, "Love is priceless," if you also believe in the beautiful, transformative power of human union. Thank you for watching, and always remember to reach for the stars.